When you work with a real estate agent, you automatically assume they have your best interests in mind. But as the saying goes, buyer beware. In many instances, the broker your agent has a contract with can be working for both sides of the sale, and getting you the best deal may not be their priority. Joining us now from Washington for a closer look at conflicts of interest among brokers is Carpenter-Israel. He's president of the Buyer's Edge Company. Hey, Stephen, welcome.
Hi, Jerry. How are you doing?
Good today. Glad you're here to explain some of these conflicts. When you say conflicts of interest, what do you mean?
Well, Jerry, the industry is set up so that most of the brokers who work in the industry represent both sides of the transactions. Not only do they have listing agents who are listing properties for sale and therefore representing the sellers, but they also have people in their office who may be representing a buyer on the same transaction.
And we should
both people are then working for that broker.
Right.
So the broker of that office has a very distinct conflict of interest where they're really signed up at that point to get the seller the highest price on the best terms for their property, and also they have a contract now with a buyer to get the buyer the lowest price on the best terms for the property.
And we should explain here that agents tend to work for a broker in a single office. Many agents, they can represent both sides of the equation here. Here's what I want to know, Stephen. Do these agents talk amongst themselves? For example, if I'm a buyer and I tell my agent, hey, I think we're going to spend, XYZ on this house. We're willing to go as high, and I give them a number. Will they pass that on to the agent that's working on the sell side?
Well, I mean, obviously, if you have an agency relationship with with the client, then that agent is not, they have a fiduciary duty in some states, not in all states, but they have a duty to protect the client's interest. But that's very difficult in a small office where you have two people, one representing the buyer, one representing the seller. Their offices or their desks are right next to each other. They sit through the same office meetings. Everybody pretty much knows what's going on in most real estate offices with, if someone's going through a divorce or if there's a problem with a sale. It's pretty much common knowledge.
Lots of information gets passed along. What about another kind of conflict, though? Agents work on commission. So the more you pay for that house, the better off they are. That might not be in your best interest.
Right. I think that the industry has always been structured on a commission basis. There are lots of companies now that are doing fee-for-service type transactions. It's certainly an interesting change in the industry, and more people are exploring it. But the fact of the matter is, on most transactions, the negotiating that goes on might negotiate over $10,000 or $20,000. The agent's cut and what they actually make out of the difference in a $10,000 swing on most transactions, may be just a couple of $100s. So oftentimes I think that that's not as big a conflict as most people perceive it as.
So how do I avoid conflicts, though? If I'm determined not to get myself in a situation where I'm not being well represented, what do I do to avoid the conflict?
Well, right now there are a couple of options. If you're a buyer, there are exclusive buyer brokerage firms that are operating throughout the country now. There's the National Association of Exclusive Buyers Agents that's at NAEBA.org, NAEBA.org. That can refer
let me interrupt
people
you here.
on.
Right. Let me interrupt you here. And they exclusively represent buyers. That's their claim to fame. Very interesting organization. But let me interrupt you here, Stephen. There aren't that many of them. I may live in a place where there are no exclusive buyer's agents. Right.
Unfortunately, that's the case. And there are, to my knowledge, there are very few companies nationally that exclusively represent sellers. The fact of the matter is that there are some, and if you're fortunate enough to have someone good in your jurisdiction who exclusively represents buyers, and the point being that their company exclusively represents buyers, not that it's an agent who represents buyers in a company that does both.
Right.
But, if you're fortunate enough to have that option, that's great. If not, then you have to be very careful and understand the terms with which you're entering into a contract. And people should be very careful to understand what their agency contract agreement says, and that what happens to them when the company that they're working with is representing both sides of the transaction.
Absolutely important.
Yeah.
And you have to know the terms of the agreement. If I'm in a situation, though, where I can't pick up an exclusive buyer's agent, how do I make sure that that agent is working on my behalf?
Well, I think that you have to ask a lot of questions at the beginning, and our, our position is that the most professional agents in the business really are very careful, and most agents do a very good job at delineating, the potential conflicts for their clients, and they, most people are very careful, and I think that at the outset, that seeking out someone in the industry who's not necessarily someone with tons of experience, but somebody who's very professional in their approach to the business and has a very good response when you ask them the questions about what happens in these specific instances where there is a conflict. How am I going to be sure that my interests are going to be represented? It's a difficult question to answer when you ask, what will the broker do if a tree hits the house before settlement? You now have a contract, and the broker now represents the seller, and in theory represents the buyer. It's a very interesting scenario.
And
So
very difficult to solve, too. Stephen Israel from
Yeah.
Buyer's Edge, thanks so much.